Okay, so here's our fifth and final video. If you're in an all online course, if you're in a hybrid class, then it's just the last one that we're going to talk about in this particular unit. So this final conversation in Unit 3 is all about adverse drug responses and consequences of drug interactions. So adverse drug responses, this is going to come into play more when we're talking about individual drugs and adverse responses to those individual drugs. But there are adverse responses that are specific to the drug, and those are things that we're going to know. So these are things that you could anticipate. And certain drugs are more likely to cause certain adverse responses, and the groups that we see often are blood abnormalities, where it may change like white blood cell count, that kind of a thing, or changes some sort of, platelet count or something along those lines. There's drugs that we know have a propensity towards liver and kidney damage. There's drugs that are known teratogens. That's why we talked about the pregnancy categories. A teratogen is something that is dangerous to the fetus. And then there's drugs that are likely to cause some dermatological effects. Lots of times those are rashes, those kinds of things. Like we see a lot of that. We see that often with drug rashes with anti-infectives. This guy Yushchenko is just sort of a good example because it was in the media. This is a while ago now, but this is a Russian Ukrainian politician who was being poisoned over time by dioxin, and so they were seeing changes in him based on the exposure to the drug. Right? I don't remember exactly the circumstances around this, but this was a good example of a visual of a toxic drug effect. And if you know about dioxin, then you would be able to then, say, oh, this looks like a drug response, potentially. So those are adverse responses to the drugs. But then there's something called drug idiosyncrasy. And idiosyncratic effects are not predictable, right? These are I talked about this, I think, in the very first unit. These are non-allergic abnormal responses, right? And probably the idiosyncratic responses have everything to do with genetics, but we just don't know that much about genetics yet. But as we learn more and more about genetics, I think we're going to be able to make some more sense out of these idiosyncratic effects. But they are it's not an allergic response, and it's not predictable. You don't know that someone's going to have one of these kinds of responses, whereas if you give a drug like acetaminophen, let's say, which we know is potentially liver toxic, and you give a hefty dose of that, you would expect the liver to take a hit with that kind of a situation. And then there's drug allergy. This is not the same as hypersensitivity. An allergy is an actual immune-mediated response that is going to happen when somebody has a histamine release or some kind of a cytokine release due to their way their immune system is managing that antigen, the thing that they're finding foreign. All right, so these terms, last couple slides here are all about interactions. And so these are terms that we've talked about before. Drugs that have an additive effect, which means they have a stronger effect when you add them together than they would have individually. Same with synergy and potentiation. These are all things that can increase the therapeutic or toxic effects, synergistic effects, when one drug potentiates another. In many cases, the one drug is inactive on its own, but it makes the other one more active. So when we start to look in earnest at people on different medications, in most cases, people, especially like in a hospital setting, people are on more than one drug. And so we have to start to think about the drugs individually and then how they interact with one another. Then there's antagonism, which of course decreases the therapeutic effect of other drugs. So really, in terms of drug interaction, what's really happening here is oftentimes the combination of one or more drugs, or two or more drugs, I should say, alter the pharmacokinetics of that drug. They might affect the binding site, the receptor site. They might increase or decrease different portions of a metabolic pathway, changing the way that drug is effective. They might alter Pharmacokinetics, meaning they change absorption, and that could happen in the case of when you change the pH of the stomach. It can happen when somebody's got a lot of vasoconstrictors on board, those kinds of things. Then there's the distribution thing. This is a competition issue, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, when we see competition for plasma proteins. And then we also have metabolic issues, where we can see a stimulation or depression of liver enzymes, depending on the combination, the addition of these different drugs. So we talked about that with our, when we talked about plasma protein binding, or pardon me, I'm sorry, when we talked about cytochrome P450 interactions. So that's kind of what we're thinking about there. And then, of course, there's excretion of the interaction of two drugs can change the way that drugs are excreted. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about diuretics. So in a nutshell, just what we're thinking about now is just in a general sense, like why we get these drug interactions. So these are some theoretical reasons why drugs may interact with one another by altering pharmacodynamics, by altering pharmacokinetics, in some way, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, that kind of a thing. All right, so with this plasma protein binding concept, this is something that oftentimes people have questions about. So here's our scenario where we have a drug that's plasma protein bound. So that means that this plasma protein has to bind this drug because it can't get transported on its own in order for it to get distributed to the receptor. The plasma protein can release the drug, and then it can bind the receptor and it can produce its effect, right? So now we've got another drug we're going to add, and it binds to a receptor, a different receptor, right? So we have two drugs, drug A and drug B. The person was on drug A, we knew it was plasma protein bound, we'd give them a loading dose, everything is good, releasing as necessary, etc. Because we gave a loading dose, the plasma proteins are occupied by this particular drug, A. But then we add drug B, and it turns out that drug B also is plasma protein bound, and the plasma proteins have a higher affinity for drug B than they do A, which means they want drug B more. So what they'll do, the plasma proteins, they have one site. They can carry A or B. So if they have a higher affinity for B, they're going to dump A and bind B, right? So here we have it. Drug A is bound to the plasma protein in the same position that drug B binds. So when we add drug B, the plasma protein is going to dump drug A, and it's going to bind more B, which means now, all of a sudden, all this A gets liberated, and this receptor for A is hit with a higher concentration of drug than it normally would be. If it went the other way, and the plasma protein likes drug A more than B, then when you give a big dose of B, thinking, oh, it's going to bind up to plasma proteins, instead it's going to flood those receptors, and you're going to have more of a response with drug B than expected. So you have to kind of think about this. And of course, this is something that you would know, hopefully, going into this. You can read in a drug book, oh, this is plasma protein bound. This is transported bound to plasma proteins. And so those are the sorts of things that we have to sort of, think about before we start thinking about how we're going to dose these drugs. And when you add another drug to somebody's regimen that already has a drug on board that's very highly protein bound, you've got to know, well, which drug is going to have a higher, which drug will the plasma protein have a higher affinity for, because that's going to affect the way you dose that. So think about that, right? Think about how you would change each drug to make both drugs more safe and effective. Think about that, and I'm anticipating somebody putting something on the discussion board and or asking me a question about this in class, so we'll talk more about it then. All right, that's it for Unit 3. We're done. This is the end of the content for your first exam. Your first exam is going to be covering content from Unit 1, 2, and 3. So check out your study guide. And again, bring any questions that you have, post them on the discussion board. And we'll go over them either on the discussion board, in a chat meeting, or together in class. All right, I will see you guys later. And next, stay tuned for the peripheral nervous system. That's what comes next.